Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. Today we are going to take a good look at what I consider to be a fairly basic subject, that being the 5 monocolor decks that are the first ones you receive on MTG Arena. Now these decks are very simple, but doesn't mean that they should be totally disregarded or otherwise overlooked. There's two key points to these decks. Number one being that they do give you some good tools and are useful, particularly since they are eternal and will always be part of Best of One standard. So it's important to know what's in there, not only for your own use, but what you can expect to see on the plate of many of your opponents, particularly in those low ranks of your single constructed play that you will very often be in as a budget player. The idea also here being that these decks are more things you take tools from. It is not necessarily where you want to spend resources like wildcards to try and upgrade these decks. Although from time to time we will build monocolored decks, just not necessarily or entirely from these bases. Basically, this can be summed up in the idea that I want you to treat these 5 decks the same way you would a stolen car. Now, hopefully most of you out there have no idea what it is to treat something like a stolen car, so allow me to elaborate. When you have a stolen car, you drive it until the wheels come off because you just don't care. You don't take it and get a tune-up, you don't put new tires on it, you don't upgrade the stereo, you just use it up until you're done with it. And that's exactly what I want you to do with these decks. But before we get into all that, let me take this opportunity to invite you to subscribe to the channel. See, back in January of this year, I set a goal of having 100 subscribers before the end of the year. And boy, have we come a long way since that time. And while I may be doing a lot of the work, I can't do it without you. You see, this isn't one of those huge YouTube channels that gains or loses 1,000 subs in a day and hardly notices. Around here, you matter. Just like all these folks here matter. See, thus far, we've got up to 81 subs out of our goal of 100. And while I know they're not all listed here, these are the folks that have answered the call and made their subscription to the channel public information. And I want to take this opportunity to not only invite you to join the community if you have not done so already, but thank all of these fine folks, because around here, my audience matters. It's what shapes the channel. It's what I drive for. And one last thing, I'd like to do something cool when we do hit that goal of 100 subscribers. Problem is, I don't really know what to do and have very few ideas. So if you have a moment and you have a thought, comment it down below on what you think we should do to celebrate our goal of 100 subscribers being reached. Now, what were we talking about? Oh, right. So let's start off the conversation with mono red, because mono red on Arena has somewhat become synonymous with a very accessible, cheap starter budget deck. So let's take a look at the mono red Goblins Everywhere Eternal deck from that standpoint and see what's relevant for us. And first off, let's talk about the rares. Immortal Phoenix, in my opinion, is very classically a red rare. Very often it is a little overcosted and a little undervalued. So not a lot of things that you're going to end up doing with this deck unless you are looking to add a little more oomph into a mono red deck, or maybe something like a red / some other color brawl deck. just not something that you're going to reach to all that much. It just doesn't have the relevant creature type that Dragon does. Siege Dragon, of course, has that dragon thing going for it. It's a 5/5 flyer, so it has pretty decent evasion, but the 7 mana on this, most of the time before you even get a chance to cast this, you've either won or lost the game. Next up is the Ogre Battle Driver. Again, not a relevant creature type, and the fact that it gives a +2/+0 actually takes it out of a range of a card we're going to talk about later as being relevant in this deck. And the fact that it's giving your later creatures haste is just not that relevant. It's not hard to find hasty creatures in red. Last up in the rares, I think is the most relevant, is the Goblin Trash Master. Not only is Goblin going to be a relevant creature type at almost any given time in Magic/Arena, the fact that it's also a warrior is very nice. And the fact that it's a lord, giving all of your other goblins, makes it pretty solid. A 3/3 for 4 is not bad given the fact that it's a lord, and it also gives you a little added utility of being able to deal with an opponent's artifact. Now, what I do think is the most relevant card in this deck, and the one that you are more often going to reach to than anything else, is this lovely little uncommon Raid Bombardment. And you're going to notice that each of these decks has a little bit of a sub-theme of a slightly pushed uncommon that makes a nice build around going on. This one is a fixed version of a card that came out during the prior Ravnica block, and whenever a creature of power 2 or less attacks, this deals a point of damage to the person or planeswalker being attacked. I guess I should say that as player or planeswalker, because we stop to be people and we are players. But in any way, this is a card I have built around before. In fact, in some years I have and probably will recommend using wildcards to get an additional 2 copies of this. But stay tuned on that. One of the first videos I do for every new season is mono red. Another one of the staples that we see here is Shock. Having this part of the Eternal format for Best of One Standard is very nice. They give you 3 copies. In most cases, this is also going to be in quote-unquote normal standard, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend picking up a 4th copy because 3 will usually do. 10th Street Goblin is a nice 1-drop and has that relevant creature type that we talked about. Nest Robber is hasty, because like I said, it's not hard to find haste, but Dinosaur tends to be a less relevant creature type, and the fact that it only gives you 1 body for the 2 mana is not hard to beat in red. Goblin Tunneler is just not that big a deal despite its relevant creature type. Burn Bright is one of those underrated commons out there, and very often ends up being a kill condition in either a mono red or a red-white go wide strategy. Very nice card. Don't sleep on this. If you're wondering what you should throw into your deck to finish off those last couple slots, very often Burn Bright is an excellent candidate. As far as the mana base, I think 25 mana is really a lot for mono red, especially if you are able to trim out some of these higher builds here. Oftentimes my mono red build tops out at either 3 mana or 4 mana, and I have dropped mountains as low as 12 mana sources. Not something to do indiscriminately, but it can work for you. So with that, let's move on to another deck here. I think what is most often considered the number 2 of the mono decks is the mono white Keep the Peace. So let's take a minute here and talk about the rares going on in this deck. Angelic Guardian for 6, flying, and a 5/5 is not out of the question. But very often, because of that 6 mana cost, it ends up being a win more. A lot of times your opponent will scoop to something like this, even though you were going to win next turn probably anyway. Inspiring Commander as a 2-of is, again, it's just too top in my opinion, to really be relevant in most games. If you're running that mono white aggro and or life matters, by the time this drops on turn 6, it's almost always a win more. Goring Ceratops, on the other hand, a 3/3 for 7 seems like a really rough way of being undercosted, but the fact that it has double strike, and when it attacks other creatures you control gain double strike as well, it ends up being a very nice top deck late game finisher. You drop this and next turn you're able to attack and give all of your creatures double strike to alpha strike them out. Let's see here. I don't think there's any rares in this column. There is not. Leonin War Leader, in my opinion, is one of the most relevant or potentially relevant rare cards in this deck. Of course, if you haven't caught on so far, none of these are going to have mythics. But the War Leader being a 1-of is kind of tough to build around. Well, actually, they do give you 2. If I was going to build around this, I might consider using a wild card for a 3rd copy, but that is not official advice. That is more a thinking point that's going to vary from year to year. But the fact that this contributes to a go wide strategy and its lifelink, like I said, it is the most potentially relevant rare in the deck, despite it still being somewhat marginal. Now, interestingly enough, the most relevant card in this deck is the 4-of copy uncommon of Hallow Priest. The fact that this gets larger when you gain life in a deck that is very consistently going to gain you life and can be constructed around allowing you to even gain more life. This becomes an absolute beat stick, and a lot of people really hate this card. Being eternal in standard, and very often may become the basis of a initial mono white deck build for us on this channel. Cards that support that are the Charmed Stray that you get a 4-of on, and these all have lifelink and get bigger. Things like Impassioned Orator as a 3-of allow you to gain life every time something comes into play. Pacifism is a nice defensive piece as the common, but it's something that can very easily or potentially be replaced by something else in standard, in some cases that will also trigger life gain. Angelic Vitality really boosts your life gain, but oftentimes by the time this is dropping on turn 3, the fact that you're gaining more life isn't really the relevant part. It's the life gain initially that matters. The fact that this becomes a 4/4 if you do have over 25 life is pretty solid, but again, that tends to be more of a win card, a win more card rather than turning the tables, because if you have a 2/2 flyer or a 4/4 flyer and have 25 life, it almost becomes irrelevant. So all in all, another one of these decks, I think it runs too many lands. I think that's something you're probably going to hear me say, talking about in every single one of these decks. I think particularly when you're running mono color, you can cut this very comfortably down to, say, 22 on the top end, and free up another 3 slots for your deck that better support the sub-theme that you've gone with. More often than not, in mono white, that's going to be life gain matters. So let's move into another deck. Now, what I firmly believe to be the number 3 of the 5 monocolors is the mono green deck. It ends up being very consistent. Green is one of those things that doesn't really change its color identity all that much. It's really all about just playing big creatures, and smashing face with it. It's a very straightforward strategy that really doesn't take very long at all to understand. In fact, I'd bet 99.9% of you already get the idea. I do want to start with one card here in the sideboard. Generous Stray is a bit underpowered, but it does allow you to draw a card. So that is something that very oftentimes you will reach for in a mono green deck, as well as anything that is like in a brawl format. Throwing one of those in there to get you that card draw in green can be very, very nice. Most of the other decks we have talked about so far didn't really have much in the sideboard. One side note that I should have discussed when we were looking at the mono red deck is the 1/1 for 1 hasty Goblin that is in the sideboard of mono red. Because of its interaction with Bombardment and the fact that it has haste for 1, that is a card that sometimes you are going to be very happy to have the 2 copies of, and in some cases we may even spend wild cards to replace those because they have not really been in standard for quite some time. Why did I close that deck? Anyway, so let's look at some of the rares here. Epic Proportion for 6 mana is definitely a win more card, or maybe just an Alpha Strike, push through the last points of damage and win a turn earlier kind of thing. This really isn't going to save you unless you already had a board state to support it, because giving a creature +5/+5 and trample is pretty much the definition of win more. Rampaging Brontodon, on the other hand, is one of those creatures that is a great filler rare for anything running green, particularly like a Brawl deck where just one card makes a big difference. Because whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each land you control. It starts as a 7/7 for 7 mana, so it's very on rate and has trample. This, in my opinion, is a much better card to finish the game than something like Epic Proportions. Next up, the now iconic Gigantosaur, because who doesn't need a 5 mana 10/10 giant dinosaur? This is basically everything green wants to be. Again, it makes a great one-of to fill space in a green deck, or a one-of in a brawl deck. 5 green mana is pretty hard to achieve in a multicolored deck, but not hard at all in mono green, where ramp is very often the answer. I have seen this card consistently played as early as turn 3, and a 10/10 on turn 3 is pretty hard to deal with any way you go about it. The final rare for the set is one that to me is a little less spectacular. It is only 4 mana. It is a semi-relevant creature type with merfolk, although green merfolk tend to be a little less relevant than blue merfolk. The forecasting cost is pretty on rate for a 3/3 that does something. The fact that it mills you and returns a card from the graveyard to the battlefield makes it very situational, particularly as a rare. This is one of those areas that I'm not sure it is always going to be the best card to add to the deck. Now, green, while it does give you a lot of tools for your collection in the case of the rares, it comes up a little short in the uncommon build-around category, which is why it's relegated to the 3rd slot of the 5, in my opinion. The honorable mentions for that is a card like Colossal Majesty that builds around that larger creature idea and can generate some card draw. In a mono green deck, I'm not sure this is what you want to be doing with turn 3, but really it is the best option in this deck for what you can do on turn 3. This is not something I can ever really see myself building around unless mono red, mono white is just really not supported in standard. This could be one of those things that we have to go to. One of the other cards in this is the Pack Hunter as a 4-of. It is still a common, but it builds up the interesting +1/+1 counters theme that we've been seeing in green and is clearly supported in this deck. The fact that it has trample and gets bigger, it's one of those cards that can become very good, but honestly, in any set that's supporting that +1/+1 counters theme in green, it very clearly gets eclipsed by better cards. So green ends up being a bit of a toolbox, but doesn't really give you anything to gravitate and build around. Cards like Jungle Delver support that +1, Stony Strength also a +1, but again, anything that's already supporting this, these are very easy and quick cuts to get better 1-drops. Things like Mana Acceleration in the Mystic and the Elysian. It makes great ramp. Depending upon what standard is doing, there might be better ramp answers. Rabid Bite is kind of the universal removal for green, but it is situational in the fact that it depends on your big green creatures to make it work. Rabid Bite in an open field is just sad. So that's basically the green deck, and let's dive in to our next. Next up on the hit parade is the mono blue deck, and once again, let's start off by talking about the rares. Riddlemaster Sphinx is again kind of the walking definition of a win more card. If you're dropping a 5/5 for 6 mana with flying, the fact that it's bouncing a creature back to your opponent's hand is probably just allowing you to win more. And unless you're just very early on in your career and still making a lot of play mistakes on Arena, this is not going to win a game for you. It's just going to make you win more. Windreader Sphinx is another one of those. 7 mana, 3/7 stats, is very undercosted even with the flying. And the fact that you're drawing a card that late in the game, if you've spent any time playing blue, there's a lot better answers for drawing cards at that point. Although this may go in a first pass of something like Flying Matters or a Blue-White Skies build. Overflowing Insight as our next rare is 7 mana, 3 of which must be blue. So this is almost impossible to splash into a 2-color deck, particularly as a budget player where you're not going to have a lot of ready access to mana fixing. And being able to draw 7 cards, again, in blue, there's a lot easier ways to draw cards. The only place I can really see this is in a very dedicated blue-based control deck. Other than that, this is just not something that you're going to use very much, with the exception of maybe like a blue-based brawl deck where something like that just becomes more relevant. A rare that I do think has a lot of relevance for 5 mana, 4/3 Soulblade Djinn. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell like a card draw or removal or a counter spell, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is a flying creature, and if you're using it in a deck built around other evasive creatures, that little boost can do a lot very quickly. This tends to be one of those that you drop on, say, turn 6, and then follow it up by unsummoning one of their major blockers, and then swing with the team in at +1 on that against their diminished line. Just ends up being a very strong position. One of the build around uncommon on this, in my opinion, for this deck is the 2 of Windstorm Drake. Other flying creatures you control get +1/+0, so it has basically allowed you to take your blue flyers or your blue-white flyers and turn it into a very significant aggro deck on turn 5 or 4, depending upon how you've played out your mana and acceleration. So this very quickly can finish games, even if it doesn't attack yet on turn 5. Just dropping that adds enough power onto the board that often you are going to get there with some evasive guys. Another card here that's important to the deck and what it adds to your collection is the 2 copies of Winged Words. This spell costs 1 less to cast if you control a creature with flying. Draw 2 cards. So the ability to draw 2 cards for 2 mana, potentially on turn 2, is a huge acceleration to your position, especially when you're drawing things like counter spells or unsummons or other very fast flying creatures. Another card here that is very nice as an uncommon and kind of a runner-up for the build-around card, although it fits the exact same theme, is the Warden of Evos Isle. 3 mana, 2/2 flying. Creatures, spells with flying you cast cost 1 mana less to cast. So this is very often how you're able to drop your Windstorm Drake on turn 4 rather than turn 5, similarly to your Soulblade Djinn, and allow you to close out those games very, very fast. This also, as you've heard me say, although I didn't talk about it in the green deck because oftentimes mana matters in green, but here 25 islands is probably a bit overkill, especially if you're dropping or changing out some of this top end stuff. You can very often go down to 20 or 22 blue sources on this and have a much more efficient deck, in my opinion. I'm not really remembering what's in the sideboard here. Let's take a look. River's Favor is a pretty nice enchantment here, although auras in general open you up for being 2 for 1. Not something that I am typically looking to do. The Zephyr Goal, I think, is misplaced in the sideboard. A 1/1 flyer for 1, in my opinion, is much better than Wall of Runes. Although if you are looking to play more of a control style, the Wall of Runes is the way to go. Not only does it lock up the ground and make a lot of your opponent's early plays irrelevant, since it can defend up to 4 before dying. Also, the Scrying makes for a very nice fixing card. And let's take a look back at that. Yeah, personally, I run all 4 copies of Zephyr Goal in most of my builds. Armored World Turtle, it's another card that if you're looking to play control, maybe drop something like that in place of the Warden Evos Isles, or maybe even the Cloudkin Seer as a better way to just stall the ground. But that's pretty much the mono blue, and we will move on. So if you've been following along, you know the last deck we're going to talk about in this video is mono black. The reason for that being, I think it kind of loses its way a little bit in what mono black wants to try and be. Starting with the sideboard cards, there are a lot of raised dead effects, and really the best thing it has going for it is the zombies in the sideboard, which zombies and vampires and sometimes either demons or skeletons can be relevant creature types. So that is a lot of what this deck has going for it. Looking at the rares here, we'll start with the Nightmare. A 6 mana, probably going to come in and be a 6/6 in a mono black deck. It's okay. A 6/6 flyer for 6 is fine. If that's the best card on the battlefield at the time, well, there you go. Demon of Loathing, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player sacrifices a creature. But if you are playing 7 mana, you have a 7/7 flying trample. The fact that they are then sacking creatures is probably more of a win more effect than it is actually winning the game in its own right. Similarly, the Soul Hunter Rakshasa, try and say that 10 times fast. Wow, try and say anything. It can't block. It's 5 mana, 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, it deals 1 damage to target opponent for each swamp you control. Oftentimes, the fact that this even remains on the battlefield is very irrelevant because oftentimes that 5 damage on turn 5 is what ends up winning you the game. Let's see here, and last for the rares is our Orc Warrior Mardu Outrider. 3 mana for a 5/5 is pretty darn good, especially if you can turn that discard a card cost into something beneficial for you, which this deck doesn't do particularly well. There are things like Sanctuary Skeleton that you can easily get back from your graveyard, but very oftentimes you will see something in black that will allow you to turn that cost into a benefit, making this even better. In my opinion, black is doing its best when you are taking your opponent's losses and turning them into your own victory. An uncommon like Eternal Thirst is a little hard to build around, in my opinion, because it is an aura and really opens you up to that 2-for-1 effect. But whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature can be very relevant. Similarly, the Cold Blade gets bigger whenever an opponent's creature dies. So again, a possible build around there that gets stronger, particularly when black is so strong with removal. Cards like Typhoid Rats as a 1/1 Death Touch for 1 really allows you to plop that down on turn 1 and then just kind of control the board for time being while you build up your resources. Compound Fracture very easily allows you to kill off your opponent's early plays. It's one of those you want to run all 4 copies because it gets better the more of those you have in your graveyard. That's another one of the few cards in this deck that allows you to pitch and gain value by putting it in the graveyard. So if you had to do something like that for your Outrider, that's probably the best play in the deck. Other than that, you get a lot of little creatures here like the Savage Gorger. Again, your opponent's loss is your gain, and very quickly can start turning the tables if they're not able to deal with this early on. A Murder is the best removal spell in the game, ... until you have any other removal spell. But it is definitely the best removal spell in the game out of these starter decks. 3 mana to indiscriminately destroy any creature is pretty awesome, especially when you have a number of things that may get stronger from their creature dying. So it's a two-way swing on the board state. You're eliminating some of their board position while simultaneously increasing your own. Skeleton Archers is another one of those that maybe takes out a creature if it's well timed. You can often use this in the second main phase to get that last point of damage if they were forced to block something and they think their creature is going to survive. This is a nice way of following that up and go ahead and knock that out and hopefully make some of your creatures even bigger from it. So that's pretty much the mono black deck. I do think it is the least, not only because it doesn't synergize quite as well as you want to, particularly on the top end, and also the top end tools that it gives you aren't always going to contribute to other decks. You'll find that it's very rare that we reach to these top end components to do much, if anything.
And with all that having been said, please take this opportunity to like, comment, and subscribe. It is the budget way to support this budget channel because it doesn't cost you a thing. Do it for Graham. Do it for the algorithm. Do it for the iced coffee. And until next time, I'll see you in the arena.